Hi, welcome to a new episode of Engineering Rebuilt.
Do you think you know a lot about construction?
Maybe we can provide a fresh perspective.
This is a podcast where we rebuild preconceptions of engineering,
Reclaim the narrative,
and share the voices of women from across the construction industry. Why not join us?
Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to our latest episode of the Engineering Rebuilt podcast. I'm your host, Lina Soderberg, together with Yvonne Raleigh, and we are so incredibly excited to have Faye Allen on our latest episode today. Faye, it's so nice to meet you on this podcast. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself to kick us off?
Yeah, so as you said, I'm Faye Allen. I work as a director in Arcadis in our Contract Solutions department, so dealing with construction disputes, trying to avoid disputes. I'm a quantity surveyor by trade, did a law degree some time ago, chartered with the RICS, and I work quite a lot with STEM. So just quite interested in, construction full stop really.
So you started off with a law degree, or you started off and then did a law degree?
I mean, if we go right back to where it started, I blame my dad. He's an estimator, and he got tired of me after I'd sort of given up on doing some more. I didn't want to go to university full time, so he was like, "Well, you're not just sitting at home. You can come out with me." Took me on a really fabulous job that Henry VIII used to stay at this. It was like a big hall residence, and they were renovating it. And I just got the bug from there, really. I just thought, actually, this is really cool. It was really interesting seeing what they were going to do with the refurb plans. And my dad being my dad was like, well, you could join the industry and you'd be really good. And when I was 18, I joined Tri Construction as they were then. And started training to be a quantity surveyor. So, I blame my dad for it all.
That sounds amazing as a first project, a refurb of a Henry VIII property. I think it beats my first project. That sounds amazing. What's made you stick with contracts and quantity surveying and that side of things? What is it that you enjoy about that?
Well, I've sort of moved from contracting. So obviously I've moved more into the consulting side probably the last 14 years or so. So I worked for quite a lot of contractors, mostly main contractors, sort of medium size, through my career as a quantity surveyor, sort of managing surveyor, commercial manager. And then I just got to a point where I've always had this like for dispute resolution and dispute avoidance. And I just decided to sort of throw my cap in the ring and go into something a bit different. So I started by getting more involved in contracts up front, on big projects in aviation, helping with all the tendering, all that sort of stuff. And then I moved to EC Harris, 8 years ago it is now. We're obviously now Arcadis. And I started working in this department. So now I do expert witness work. I can work with clients trying to help them to avoid a dispute, can help them put a claim together if they've got a problem, can get involved in mediations with them, and just basically trying to support them through the process if they are in a dispute, or hopefully if they're not there yet, helping them to avoid it.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting turn in approach, because contractors quite often get involved in disputes, and I think a lot of that is down to a lack of understanding at the point that they do the tender, of what they're actually signing up to. And then when you get into contract, there's quite often a lack of robust contract management, certainly with some of the smaller contractors. And to get into that resolution stage where you're helping people to be better at what they're doing. I mean, that must be quite rewarding.
Yeah, I mean, I've done sort of like where I'll go in and actually speak to people's surveyors, for example, and talk to them about sort of how better to manage their contracts, what sort of information to keep. Because obviously if you do get into a dispute with the sort of people who come and go, okay, we want this, this and this to help you, and often it isn't there, or you've got to really fight to find it. So it's quite good when you go into companies and you can try and help them to not get in those situations. But I think it's also quite interesting when they are in that situation to be able to support them through it, because a lot of the time people have got entrenched in their positions, and you know, when you start pulling out the evidence and helping them to actually put a claim together, for example, you can sort of see the mindset change. I mean, it's been quite interesting. We did a job a few years ago and I had to give evidence in the TCC, and that was actually quite scary. It was like my first time giving evidence. Quite interesting being questioned by a QC on the other side. They can be quite difficult, but I actually quite enjoyed it in a way as well, because I think I knew my quantum report very well. I was very happy with what I'd done, and I think that makes the difference. I think with anything that I've done, I think as long as you're happy with the work you've done and that you've handed over and that you feel like you're supporting your client, or in that case, obviously, because as an expert, your first duty is to the court, you know, as long as you're doing what you should be doing, I think you can sort of go home and feel happy, really.
Yeah, that sounds quite exciting, being part of that part of it, and as an expert witness. How do you find that's different from the normal sort of disputes resolution and other parts of it?
I think, I mean, I'd say probably 90% of the work is in adjudication or helping put claims together. So they're often very quick. You know, I remember writing a dissertation on adjudication when it first came out, and I think I called it rough justice. And in some ways it still is, but it is a quick and fairly effective way for a dispute to not always be settled. Often it does go further, but it will often release money, which is what it was obviously intended to do when parties are not in a good position with each other. I don't think it's very often they go all the way to court. You often get claims and you're working on them, and then people will mediate or they'll settle. But I quite like the variety, and I think particularly when you're working on adjudications, because it's a fairly short process, even though it can be extended, you aren't like when I was working on a job, I might be on one job for sort of 3 years or 4 years. With this, you know, you could be working on quite a few adjudications in a year. So I think I quite enjoy the variety. You know, I think when I was doing the surveying, I loved sort of seeing the buildings go up and being involved in, you know, all of that. And it's nice to drive past one and go, oh, I was involved in that. But it's a longer process, isn't it? And I think for me, I just needed to have something that just gave me that variety and a bit of spice, really. And I think that's what, you know, helping clients does. You know, I've got one at the moment where I'm helping them write a procedure, for example, so that they can actually try and avoid getting into any difficult situations. And that's something they want to share with their stakeholders and supply chain. So there's all sorts of different ways that we can help people, not just when they've actually got into that point where they're in adjudication. We can try and help way before that as well, which I think is really important. And I think, Yvonne, you touched on, you know, construction disputes. Yeah, a lot of them are where the contract isn't run properly. You know, it's not administered correctly, or people don't understand what they've signed up to. You know, you do see that quite a lot. But I think we also see quite a lot with defective works, for example. You can have quite a lot of disputes that will occur around that, particularly after the Grenfell issue. There's been a lot of cladding issues, for example, with that, haven't there? So, yeah, it can be quite interesting depending on what's happening in the industry at the time. So, yeah, like I say, I think it's the variety that I do enjoy.
How can people avoid getting into disputes?
Oh, that's the $50 million question, isn't it? I think there's a lot of ways that if you were doing things perfectly in a perfect world, you would set the job up properly to start with. I think a lot of the times when you're a contractor, you know, everyone's squeezing you. You're in a tendering process where people aren't necessarily wanting best value. They're wanting the cheapest price. And I think that can push people into the wrong place to start with. I think if clients can understand that best value actually will long term give them the better option rather than just going for the cheapest, because what you often see, and I'm sure you've seen it as well, when you go for the cheapest, you have either got a contractor who's going to struggle to stay within that price. You may have them that they've given a very cheap prelim, for example, and then when you actually get on site, I had it on nearly every job I worked on, the prelims that you've got aren't what the estimated prelims were. They'll often be a massive amount different, because to run the job properly, you need more people. So I think trying to understand, that yes, it may be more expensive up front when you look at it, when you're comparing tenders, but sometimes picking the cheapest isn't the best way to go. And I think, having staff that are properly trained and understand the contract's quite important. So I think I mentioned before we came on, I was at an NEC conference last week, and, that contract's a really, really good contract if it's followed properly. There's a lot of quite tight timescales in it. It is administrative. And if it is run correctly by both sides, it's a brilliant contract. But where you see people fall down, it's where they don't notify compensation events in time. And, then the project manager might not reply in time. And then you get yourself into a whole scenario where all of the timeline has gone, contractors have got disallowed cost, and it can just really compound issues and end up in a dispute. So I think contract management is probably one of the main things, besides pricing it properly in the first place. And, until we get into that mentality of not forcing people to go for the cheapest option and not expecting the cheapest price all the time, I don't think some things will change. I think we've got some contractors who are really good at, and I've got very good clients who understand that process, but I think we've still probably got quite a long way to go.
No, I was just going to say, it's interesting because I do the tendering side of things for quite a lot of contractors, and you see there's a difference between public procurement and private procurement. Quite a lot of private clients, actually you'd think they'd be more focused on getting their pound of flesh, but quite a lot of the private clients are more interested in the quality of what they're getting. They want to buy it once, and so they don't mind a slightly higher price. Whereas in public procurement, it always seems to be, we're looking for the cheapest price. The tender is all about the price, not the quality. And even when there's a quality element to it, that the marking of that quality element is set up in such a way that the price still really dictates where people are going. And I think that a lot of the public clients could learn quite a lot from the way that some of the big private clients procure things, because there is certainly a much more focused approach to quality and whole life costing and making sure that they actually get a product that they can keep using. So I don't know if you find the same, Faye?
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I mean, I've done some public procurement, and I think you're right. I think the weighting for the commercial side of it is often very, very disjointed with, they should be actually looking at what is the value of what you're going to get, how long will it last, is it going to have the longevity of 20 years that you're setting, what's the running cost going to be. And I think, that ends up being a very small thought in some of the procurement, definitely. And I think, I have had some private clients who do obviously think in the way you're saying, a little bit more enlightened, and they are looking for best value. But then when I look at the dispute side of things that I see, often it is because, it was probably a little bit too cheap, in some instances, and that will get the contractor in trouble, and then it will cause other problems that will occur. So, you get things with design and build, obviously, where there's a specification, but they'll pick something really, really cheap because they didn't price it properly, and then the client's not happy, and, you can get all sorts of issues with that, can't you? So it is, I think it's something that fundamentally needs to change, but how we do that, I don't know. That's probably a much wider conversation, isn't it? Trying to get sort of the public procurement side to sort of think a little bit more enlightened, because I mean, obviously they do have budgets and they do have to stick to them, so you do have that difficulty. That's a conundrum I can't answer. I don't think. I think that'd be one that a lot of people would have to work on.
No, I was going to say, I think you're absolutely right. But yeah, I mean, certainly there's a will to change, I think, in some clients. So hopefully that will move forward. Sorry, Lina, I cut across you. What were you going to say?
No, I think very similar, but I think at least where I've been involved with tenders or spoken to people who are tendering, you do feel like you're starting to see a change in behaviours where people are looking at value dimensions wider than just the lowest price, and trying to understand what is actually the best overall submission and what's actually going to give us the best outcome at the end of it, rather than what's the cheapest route to get there. So I do think with things like Project 13 from the IC and other things that you're starting to see that shift in behaviour. And then I think maybe we have that issue where people set out with those intentions, and then when things get difficult, then they revert back to how they're used to behaving, whether they like it or not, and then you end up in the in the normal situation, which I think is what you're describing, Faye, and I think we're all guilty of that. Is when things are easy, it's easy to do things the right way, but when they get a bit trickier, then it's easy to revert back to maybe some bad behaviours.
So I'm really interested in what you do outside of work, Faye, because you're doing something that gels quite nicely with the reason that we set up this podcast. So why don't you tell us about your baby?
Yeah, so I've decided to write a book. It started off as it was going to be very much, this has been my experience in construction as a female. And then the more I've sort of worked with the book mentor, the more it's become now I want to talk about lots of women in construction. So that's why I contacted you, because I'm case studying other females. I want to not just see some of the difficulties we've had, but see how women have overcome it, what strengths they've got, what advice they can give to other women, because sadly, having done London Build in November last year and speaking to some of the women there on the diversity stage, it's very evident there are still issues, and it's not so much gender imbalance. I think there's just a real issue with construction is still seen as a very male-dominated industry, and I think sadly, women make up, I think it's about 14%. It's microscopic when you look at other industries, and I think it's something that it's changing, but it's at a glacial pace. And I think when you get to a certain point of age, not that we like to admit that we're at a certain age, but I think when you get to a certain level at the moment, the pool is so small because there are so few women who may have either started in it in the first place or stayed in it. And I think that's something that's really interested me. I think we've lost a lot of good women along the way, and it's trying to make sure that we can not have that happen in future. And it's also morphed into, what are the good behaviours that we've seen? Because all of us will have worked with some men in the industry who have been really supportive, who've pushed us, not just horrible people who may have bullied or, been sexist or, just not been very supportive, full stop, of the fact that there's a woman on site. I think there's been some really good role models that I've had and that other women have had. And I feel, looking at the behaviours that they've got is very important as well, because I think if we want a step change in the way women are treated, we also have to look at some of the behaviours that are really good as well as those that are bad. So it's changed from being just a sort of, this is what my experience was, to this is what lots of women's experiences is. This is the issues that we're still having and the ones that we really don't want to continue having. And, these are the sort of values and characteristics of people who can help. Maybe even hints from, the case studies of, what can you do if you have certain situations, how to deal with it. Because particularly with young females coming into the industry, if they aren't in a very supportive environment, it can be very distressing when you have your first sort of, hiccup at work. You might have done something wrong and you panic. I think, gender-wise, men and women do think differently. There's no way of denying that. And I think that's something that can be a real strength. And I think, I've been told, I remember my first boss, who I'm still in contact with now, he said to me, I used to get a very different result just because of the way that I approach things. We do think in a different way, and that isn't a bad thing. And I think having that balance of men and women in the industry can only be a good thing, and it can actually be really lucrative for clients. So yeah, that's sort of what the baby is. It's morphed into something quite big. I'm looking forward to obviously doing a case study with you, Yvonne. And I just think, if there's anyone else who fancies getting involved, I'd be happy to speak to them, because I just think, and if you know a man who you think's a really good role model, let me know, because if they want to speak, I'd be happy to speak to them as well, because I think it's something that it could grow into something really helpful for men and for women, and I think that's what I'd like it to be.
A few men definitely come to mind for me as well, and I think that's a really good way of looking at it, is like, what are the good behaviours that we'd like to see more of? I really like that way of approaching it. Have you had any so far as you've been working on the book of like, these are some of the ones I'd like to promote?
I think we mentioned just before I came on, didn't we, that I've been speaking to a behavioural person. So I find that side of it quite interesting, because I think, you've got unconscious bias that we all have. I had a quite interesting conversation a few weeks ago with a lady, and she did it with a few of us women, and she read out various different careers, and she said, I want you to tell me what pops in your head. And for things like doctor, scientist, they came out straight away as male, even though in my brain I went, yeah, but women can do that as well. But it just shows everyone has it, and it's something that we all need to be aware of. And, when someone says nurse, you don't immediately necessarily think of a male nurse. And I think, this is something that also, there's probably a little bit of this in all of us, and it's something that's probably had an impact on a lot of people. And it's something that, it's a massive topic. It's not something I can cover in a lot of depth, but it's something that I do need to touch on, because it does affect behaviours, how people are treated, and obviously how people move on with their career. If you have a bad experience, like some of the women that I went to university with, there were 7 of us that started, and I'm the only one who's left in construction. So it can be something, small that will make you leave. Some might go into consulting and they won't stay with contractors. Some might just do something completely different, and a number of them have. And I think, that's really sad, because what started as a really excited group of women in a university course doing our surveying degree, has ended with me, and I think there's a lady in America now who's still working in a construction consulting company. And, that's sad, because you think of that percentage of people that potentially could be in that pool of people now of a certain age who could actually be really making an impact. So I think from my perspective, it's quite important to do that. I think it's one of the reasons that I like working with the CITB, and now it's STEM, trying to show kids that this is a really good career, even for a girl. Because when I was younger, I was lucky. I had my dad. He told me how great it was. He took me out on jobs. I mean, I remember when I was little, I had a little kiddie's hard hat, and he used to take me to the yard where he was working, and I used to sort of see stuff. So, a lot of girls don't have that. And I feel like, it's really nice when you go in and you say to them, look, you could be an engineer, you could be an architect, you could be a surveyor. There's so many different careers in construction that people aren't really aware of. And it's really nice when you sort of see their eyes light up and think, oh, actually, this is something I hadn't thought of.
Yeah, I think you're one of the first people we've had on the podcast who actively targeted the construction industry even before they'd gone to university. Most people we speak to maybe studied something else, or didn't even know that this option existed, and then ended up doing work experience kind of close to the construction industry, or ended up connected to it somehow. And then once they were in, they were like, oh, well, this is fabulous. I'll stay here. This is a lot of fun. But you're one of the first people we've had who's come through like a very direct route. So that's quite interesting. And also the retention piece, because I think we talk a lot about how we get more women into the industry. Or at least my first 5 or so years in the industry, that was all people talked about, was like, well, we just need to get more people in. And then the last couple of years, it's been more like, oh, okay, no, actually, we need to convince them to stay. we can't just get them in. We need to get them in, and then we need to convince them to stay. And that's kind of seems to be a recent realization over the last few years, that there's a lot more work to do in that space. And it sounds like your book is going to do a lot for that as well.
Yeah, and if someone's had a really bad day and they see something that just shows them that, what other people have been here before, and they've still gone on and ploughed ahead, and, you can do it. I think, from my perspective, that's really important, because I didn't have that, but I did have great cheerleaders in my very first boss and my mum and dad. And I think, not everybody has that. And, it's a horrendous amount of years that I've known Gary Mumford, his name is. He'll laugh because I always mention him when I get a chance. But, I put him up for an Inspirational People in Construction Award, which he won some years ago. And that is because he saw something that not a lot of people back then really did see. And he's always championed women in construction. And I've always loved that about him, because back then it was quite a rarity. I think one of my first days working, I think I heard someone make a comment that I wasn't going to be good enough and I'd never pass my degree and all this sort of stuff. And, I could have taken that to heart, but I had him and my dad and mum at home all going, well, that's just a load of nonsense. You just need to prove him wrong. And, it's that sort of cheerleading that you need. So I want the book to be that for people as well. I want people to sort of have that feeling that, other people have had this experience and this is how they dealt with it. And yes, sometimes it is really difficult, and you do go home and you might have a cry, or you might be really angry and shout at something. But at the end of the day, you've just got to try and keep moving. And the only way that change will happen is if we all do keep moving together.
Yeah, I can really relate to that. The first bit of what you were talking about, I think for me, having some really good people around me on my first project when I joined the industry was really like defining, because that gave me that base confidence that people who I looked up to also thought that I had something to offer and that I added value. And so then, like, when I've had more challenging situations since then, it doesn't get to me, because I've got that base confidence from before of knowing that, you've got, you know your own value to some extent. So I think that's really important, and being those cheerleaders for other people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're coming pretty close to the end of the podcast, unfortunately. We've crashed through 30 minutes nearly already. So where do you think the industry will be in the next 5 years, Faye? I mean, is that something that you've thought about?
I think things are changing, and I'd like to think, if I think from the personal sort of book perspective, that more women will come into the industry, that we will continue to see diversity move in. And I'd like to see, young people seeing this as a really exciting career, and not just, young girls, but boys as well, because, even they sometimes don't know the options that are available to them. I think also I'd really like to see more refurbishment of old buildings. I think we've got a lot of wasted capacity everywhere, and everyone talks about housing shortages and everything else, but you just look around at all the empty buildings we've got, and I know brownfield sites can be difficult to deal with. I dealt with one not so long ago, and it was huge, but you might have to decontaminate land and deal with all the other issues, but why are we wasting opportunities that we have? And when we're talking about the environment and how important that is, why are we just ripping stuff down and then building it again, when we can actually reuse and reutilize and make really, really good things out of what we've already got? So yeah, that's what I'd like to sort of see happen, and what I think is starting to happen. Maybe not as quick as I'd like it, but that's where I'd like to see it.
Yeah, I like that about refurbishment of old buildings. I think maybe because people aren't used to it, or that's not the way that we're trained to think. We're trained to, demolish and start from scratch. That's what we always do. So maybe it's just like a knowledge gap thing of making sure that people know that those options exist and how to work with them. Yeah. Well, it's been absolutely brilliant having you on the podcast. I'm really excited to hear more about your book, Faye. So please keep us in the loop.
I will. I think I've just decided you're a case study as well, Lina.
Oh, Lina is definitely a case study.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's been really good.
Faye, if you got if you share with us, we'll happy to share a link so people can get in touch with you. So that if they want to be involved, then we'll put that on our website so that they can be involved as well. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thanks very much for joining us on Engineering Rebuilt, and we will undoubtedly pick up this conversation at another time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Engineering Rebuilt. We hope you enjoyed being part of the conversation. Please join us next time to hear more diverse stories from people who are reclaiming their narrative to rebuild engineering.